Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Beverly Hills, May 12, 1998, 3:17 a.m. Frank Sinatra lay in the hospital bed, his legendary voice reduced to a whisper, his piercing blue eyes dimmed by age and illness. At 82, the chairman of the board was dying, and he knew it. The massive heart attack 2 days earlier had left him weak and reflective, struggling with thoughts and regrets he had carried in silence for over 2 decades. Nancy Sinatra sat beside her father's bed, holding his weathered hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The machines monitoring his vital signs provided the only sound in the room until Frank suddenly gripped his daughter's hand with surprising strength and spoke words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Nancy," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with an intensity that made her lean closer. "I need to tell you something about Elvis. Something I should have said a long time ago." Nancy expected her father to share a fond memory of his friendship with Elvis Presley, who had died 20 years earlier. Instead, Frank Sinatra made a confession that shattered everything she thought she knew about her father's relationship with the king of rock and roll. "I was jealous of him," Frank said, tears forming in his eyes. "God help me. I was jealous of Elvis Presley my whole life. He had the voice I wish I had, the connection with people I could never achieve. I spent 40 years pretending I wasn't, but I was, and now it's too late to tell him." This is the documented story of Frank Sinatra's final confession, the jealousy he harbored in secret for over 2 decades, and how the ghost of Elvis Presley haunted the last years of America's greatest crooner. The roots of Frank Sinatra's secret jealousy toward Elvis Presley stretched back to the mid-1950s, when the young rock and roll sensation burst onto the national scene and fundamentally changed the landscape of American popular music. Sinatra, already established as the premier entertainer of his generation, watched Elvis's meteoric rise with a mixture of professional concern and personal discomfort that he would never publicly acknowledge. While Sinatra dismissed rock and roll in interviews and public statements, privately he was studying Elvis with the intensity of a general analyzing a rival army. Frank was absolutely obsessed with Elvis from the very beginning, recalled Jilly Rizzo, Sinatra's close friend and confidant for over 30 years. He'd watch every TV appearance, listen to every record, analyze every performance. Frank said he was trying to understand the phenomenon, but I think he was really trying to understand why Elvis could do things with an audience that Frank couldn't. The source of Sinatra's jealousy wasn't Elvis's commercial success. Frank had achieved enormous financial success and critical acclaim throughout his career. The jealousy stemmed from something deeper and more painful, Elvis's natural, effortless connection with audiences that seemed to transcend mere entertainment and approach something spiritual. Sinatra was a master technician, a consummate professional who had studied every aspect of vocal performance and stage presence. His success was built on intelligence, hard work, and sophisticated understanding of musical interpretation. Elvis, by contrast, seemed to operate on pure instinct and emotion, creating connections with audiences that felt mystical rather than technical. Frank could make you admire him, respect him, even love him, observed arranger Nelson Riddle, who worked closely with both performers. But Elvis could make you believe in him. There's a difference, and Frank understood that difference better than anyone. This fundamental distinction between technique and transcendence would torment Sinatra throughout his relationship with Elvis, creating a jealousy that was professional, personal, and spiritual, all at once. The first major incident that intensified Sinatra's secret jealousy occurred in 1960, during the famous private gathering where Frank first heard Elvis sing gospel music. While the public story focused on Sinatra's gracious acceptance of Elvis as a peer, the private reality was more complex and psychologically devastating for Frank. According to multiple witnesses, Sinatra's stunned reaction to Elvis's performance of "He Knows Just What I Need" wasn't just appreciation. It was recognition of something he knew he could never achieve himself. Frank was shaken by that performance in ways that went far beyond professional admiration, recalled pianist Bill Miller, who witnessed the entire encounter. "I saw Frank's face during Elvis's gospel singing, and it wasn't just respect, it was envy. Frank realized that Elvis had access to something authentic and powerful that all of Frank's technique and sophistication couldn't match. The gospel performance revealed to Sinatra that Elvis's appeal wasn't just about youth or novelty or rock and roll rebellion. Elvis possessed a spiritual authenticity in his singing that connected directly to people's hearts in ways that bypassed intellectual analysis or critical judgment. For Sinatra, who had built his entire career on cerebral interpretation and emotional sophistication, the discovery that Elvis could achieve transcendence through pure spiritual expression was both inspiring and devastating. After that night, Frank started questioning everything about his own approach to music, observed Sammy Davis Jr., who remained close to Sinatra throughout this period. Frank began wondering if all his sophistication and technique were actually barriers to the kind of genuine connection that came so naturally to Elvis. This self-doubt would plague Sinatra for the remainder of his career, creating an internal tension between his public confidence and his private insecurities about his own authenticity compared to Elvis's natural spiritual expression. The jealousy intensified throughout the 1960s as both performers' careers evolved in different directions. Sinatra's work during this period, while commercially successful and critically acclaimed, began to feel calculated and safe compared to Elvis's continued willingness to take emotional and artistic risks. Elvis's gospel recordings, in particular, drove Sinatra to distraction. Albums like His Hand in Mine and How Great Thou Art showcased exactly the kind of spiritual authenticity that Sinatra envied, proving that Elvis's connection to sacred music wasn't just a novelty but a fundamental aspect of his artistic identity. Frank would listen to Elvis's gospel albums obsessively, recalled arranger Don Costa, who worked with Sinatra during the 1960s. He'd study them like they were textbooks, trying to understand how Elvis achieved that level of spiritual communication through music. Frank wanted to find that same connection in his own work, but he never quite managed it. Sinatra's attempts to incorporate more spiritual and emotional directness into his own recordings during this period reflected his ongoing struggle with Elvis's example. Albums like September of My Years and A Man and His Music showed Sinatra pushing toward greater personal revelation, but always within the controlled framework of his sophisticated musical approach. The contrast between Sinatra's controlled vulnerability and Elvis's uninhibited spiritual expression created a source of ongoing frustration that Sinatra could never resolve or overcome. The most painful period of Sinatra's jealousy came during Elvis's Las Vegas Renaissance in the late 1960s and 1970s. Sinatra had essentially created the template for sophisticated Las Vegas entertainment, establishing himself as the king of the city's showrooms through his combination of musical excellence and personal magnetism. When Elvis returned to live performance in 1969 with his historic international hotel engagement, he didn't just match Sinatra's Vegas success. He transcended it, creating a new standard for live entertainment that made even Sinatra's legendary performances seem tame by comparison. Frank went to see Elvis's Vegas show multiple times, always in disguise or in private booths, revealed Jilly Rizzo in a 1999 interview. He'd come back from those shows shaking his head, muttering things like, "How does he do it?" or "The kid's got something I'll never have." It was eating Frank alive. Elvis's Vegas performances showcased everything that Sinatra envied about the younger performer: the spiritual intensity, the emotional abandon, the complete connection with audiences, the ability to make every person in a 2,000-seat showroom feel personally addressed. These were qualities that Sinatra admired and desperately wanted to possess. More painfully, Elvis achieved this transcendence while performing in Sinatra's own domain, the sophisticated Las Vegas showrooms where Frank had established the standards for professional excellence. Elvis didn't just succeed in Vegas, he revolutionized it, proving that audiences hungered for the kind of authentic emotional expression that had always been Elvis's greatest gift. The financial success of Elvis's Vegas residencies also troubled Sinatra, not because Frank needed the money, but because the economic success proved that audiences preferred Elvis's approach to entertainment over the more traditional, sophisticated approach that Sinatra represented. Frank started questioning whether his whole career had been built on outdated ideas about what entertainment should be. observed composer Jimmy Van Heusen, who worked with Sinatra for decades. Elvis was proving that audiences wanted something more raw, more honest, more emotionally direct than what Frank had been giving them. The personal dimension of Sinatra's jealousy became most apparent during his interactions with other entertainers who expressed admiration for Elvis. Frank's reactions to praise for Elvis revealed the depth of his psychological struggle with the younger performer's success and appeal. Dean Martin, Sinatra's closest friend and frequent collaborator, often spoke admiringly of Elvis's natural talent and stage presence. These conversations inevitably led to tense moments where Sinatra's carefully controlled public persona would crack slightly, revealing his underlying resentment. Frank would get quiet and withdrawn whenever the conversation turned to Elvis, Martin recalled in a late career interview. You could see him struggling with something, like he wanted to say what he really thought, but couldn't allow himself to be that vulnerable. The vulnerability that Sinatra feared revealing was his recognition that Elvis possessed qualities that Frank had spent his entire career trying to develop through technique and professionalism. Elvis's natural charisma, his intuitive understanding of audiences, and his spiritual authenticity represented everything that Sinatra had to work for and still couldn't completely achieve. This realization forced Sinatra to confront uncomfortable truths about his own limitations and the possible artificiality of his carefully constructed persona. The man who had built his career on supreme self-confidence was privately struggling with profound self-doubt about his authenticity compared to Elvis's natural gifts. The jealousy also manifested in Sinatra's increasing preoccupation with his own legacy and place in entertainment history. As Elvis's influence grew and his status as a cultural icon solidified, Sinatra became more concerned about how he would be remembered in comparison to the king of rock and roll. Frank started talking more about his place in music history during the 1970s, observed arranger Gordon Jenkins, who worked with Sinatra on several projects during this period. He was worried that Elvis had changed popular music in ways that made Frank's contributions seem old-fashioned or irrelevant. These concerns about legacy intensified after Elvis's death in 1977, when the worldwide outpouring of grief and the immediate elevation of Elvis to legendary status demonstrated the depth of connection that Elvis had achieved with global audiences. The public mourning for Elvis was unlike anything seen for any entertainer in American history, proving that Elvis's impact transcended music to touch fundamental aspects of human emotion and cultural identity. For Sinatra, the scope of this mourning was both tribute to Elvis's greatness and painful evidence of the kind of love that had always eluded Frank, despite his enormous success. Frank was deeply affected by the reaction to Elvis's death, recalled Nancy Sinatra in a 1999 interview. He kept saying things like, "Look how much they loved him," or, "He meant something to people that I never meant." It was heartbreaking to watch Dad struggle with those feelings. The period immediately following Elvis's death marked the beginning of Sinatra's most intense private struggle with his jealousy and regret. The finality of Elvis's death meant that Frank would never have the opportunity to express his true feelings about Elvis's talent or to resolve his complicated emotions about their relationship. During the 1980s and 1990s, as Sinatra's own career began winding down, his preoccupation with Elvis intensified rather than diminished. Friends and family members noted that Frank would often bring up Elvis in conversations, usually in the context of discussing great performers or analyzing what made certain entertainers special. Frank became almost obsessed with trying to understand what made Elvis so special, observed Sinatra's longtime friend Tony Bennett. Frank would analyze Elvis's recordings, watch videotapes of his performances, read books about his life. It was like Frank was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for decades. This obsession reflected Sinatra's ongoing struggle to come to terms with his own feelings about Elvis and his place in entertainment history. The man who had dominated American popular music for 4 decades was confronting the possibility that Elvis had achieved something more significant and lasting than anything in Frank's own career. The psychological burden of carrying this secret jealousy and regret began affecting Sinatra's health and emotional well-being during his final years. Family members and close friends noticed increasing moments of melancholy and introspection, particularly when conversations turned to music or entertainment. Dad started having what I can only describe as emotional episodes during his last few years, Nancy Sinatra recalled. He'd get quiet and distant, and we'd later find out he'd been thinking about Elvis or listening to Elvis's records. It was like he was carrying around this heavy weight that he couldn't put down. The weight of unexpressed emotions and unresolved feelings about Elvis created a psychological burden that Sinatra carried until his final illness. The regret about never sharing his true feelings with Elvis, while Elvis was alive, tormented Frank during his declining health. Dr. Michael DeBakey, who treated Sinatra during several health crises in his later years, noted the psychological component of Frank's physical decline. Frank was carrying emotional burdens that were affecting his physical health, Dr. DeBakey observed. He spoke often about regrets, particularly about things he wished he had said to people who were no longer alive. The specific regret about Elvis became increasingly prominent in Sinatra's thoughts as his own mortality became apparent. The realization that he would die without ever having expressed his true admiration and respect for Elvis's talent created a sense of urgency about confession and reconciliation. The final confession came during Sinatra's last hospitalization, in May 1998, when declining health and the prospect of death finally broke down the psychological barriers that had prevented Frank from expressing his true feelings about Elvis. The conversation with Nancy Sinatra, that began with his admission of jealousy, continued for nearly an hour, with Frank unburdening himself of decades of unexpressed emotions and regrets about his relationship with Elvis. Dad told me that he had always known Elvis was a better singer than he was, Nancy recalled in a 2010 interview. Not more successful, not more popular, but actually better, more natural, more spiritual, more capable of touching people's hearts. Dad said that Elvis had a gift from God that Frank had spent his whole career trying to find in himself. The confession included specific details about songs and performances that had particularly affected Sinatra over the years. Frank admitted that Elvis's recording of "It's Now or Never" had haunted him for decades, because it showcased exactly the kind of vocal power and emotional directness that Frank envied. Dad said he must have listened to "It's Now or Never" 1,000 times, trying to understand how Elvis made it sound so effortless and authentic, Nancy remembered. Frank said that when he tried to sing with that kind of emotional openness, it always felt forced or calculated. But for Elvis, it was just natural. The admission about "It's Now or Never" was particularly significant because the song was based on the classic Neapolitan song, "O Sole Mio," which was well within Sinatra's wheelhouse as a sophisticated interpreter of classic material. Elvis's transformation of the song into something completely his own represented everything that Sinatra admired and envied about Elvis's musical approach. Frank also confessed to Nancy that he had often wondered what might have happened if he had been more honest about his admiration for Elvis during Elvis's lifetime. The missed opportunities for genuine friendship and artistic collaboration tormented Sinatra during his final days. Dad kept saying, "What if I had told him? What if I had been honest about how much I respected his talent?" Nancy recalled. He thought maybe they could have been real friends. Maybe they could have learned from each other. The regret was just eating him alive. The confession revealed that Sinatra's public dismissal of rock and roll and his sometimes condescending attitude toward Elvis had been defensive mechanisms designed to protect his own ego from acknowledging Elvis's superior natural gifts. Frank admitted that all his criticism of rock and roll had been about his own insecurity, not about the music itself, Nancy remembered. He said he had been afraid that admitting Elvis's greatness would diminish his own accomplishments, but now he realized it would have just shown that he understood real talent when he heard it. The final words that Sinatra spoke about Elvis before losing consciousness were a direct address to his deceased rival. "Elvis, I'm sorry I never told you how great you were. You had everything I wanted and could never have. I hope you knew, somehow, that I respected you more than I respected any other singer in my lifetime." Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, taking with him decades of secret admiration and regret about his relationship with Elvis Presley. The confession to Nancy provided some relief from the psychological burden he had carried, but it also revealed the tremendous emotional cost of maintaining a false public persona for over 20 years. The impact of Sinatra's deathbed confession on his family and close friends was profound and lasting. Nancy Sinatra struggled for years with the knowledge that her father had carried such painful emotions in secret, and she began to reassess many aspects of Frank's career and personality in light of his admission about Elvis. Learning about Dad's feelings toward Elvis changed how I understood his whole life, Nancy reflected in later interviews. So many of his decisions, his career choices, his attitudes toward other performers, it all made more sense when I realized he was carrying around this secret jealousy and admiration. The confession also provided new insights into Sinatra's later career choices and his increasing focus on sophisticated, adult-oriented material during the 1970s and 1980s. Rather than representing artistic growth or commercial calculation, these choices reflected Frank's attempt to carve out a musical territory where he couldn't be compared unfavorably to Elvis. Frank retreated into sophistication and technical excellence because those were areas where he felt confident competing, observed music historian Will Friedwald. But the confession reveals that he always knew those qualities weren't the same as the spiritual authenticity that made Elvis so special. The story of Sinatra's secret jealousy also illuminates broader themes about artistic competition, professional insecurity, and the psychological costs of maintaining public personas that conflict with private emotions. For a man who built his career on projecting confidence and control, the admission that he had spent decades envying another performer's natural gifts revealed a vulnerability that complicated, but ultimately humanized his legendary status. The confession demonstrated that even the greatest artists struggle with self-doubt and comparison to their peers, and that success and acclaim don't eliminate the fundamental human need for authentic expression and genuine connection. Perhaps most significantly, Sinatra's deathbed admission about Elvis revealed the tragedy of missed opportunities for connection and understanding between two of America's greatest entertainers. The genuine friendship and artistic collaboration that might have developed if Frank had been honest about his feelings represented a loss not just for both performers, but for American popular music as a whole. The legacy of Sinatra's confession continues to influence how music historians and fans understand the relationship between technique and authenticity in popular music, and the complex emotions that drive artistic competition and creative development. Frank Sinatra's final words about Elvis Presley, "The voice I wish I had," stand as a testament to the power of authentic artistic expression, and a reminder that even legends can be humbled by recognizing greatness in others. The chairman of the board died envying the king of rock and roll, carrying to his grave the regret that he had never been brave enough to express his admiration while Elvis was alive to hear it. In the end, Frank Sinatra's greatest performance may have been maintaining for over 20 years the illusion that he wasn't deeply, profoundly jealous of Elvis Presley's God-given gift for touching human hearts through the incomparable power of authentic musical expression.